Yes.
Good evening, friends, and welcome once again to HLF Online. And on this auspicious occasion of Gandhi Jayanti, I welcome you all to this evening's session. And for this session, we are delighted to have a theme and a book in discussion about a theme that is very dear to Gandhiji, which is the future of India, and also about the youth and the youth's role in India of tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening we have Professor Pradeep Chhibber, one of the authors of India Tomorrow. This is a book under discussion today. And unfortunately, the second author, Shah, could not be with us due to unavoidable reasons. We will really miss Harsh in this conversation, but we have Professor Pradeep Chhibber with us this evening. And in conversation with Professor Pradeep Chhibber is Professor Manjari Kajju. And just to quickly introduce both the author and the moderator for this evening, Professor Pradeep Chhibber is a professor of political science at University of Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, and he has written extensively on India's political parties and the political system and identity and various other aspects of Indian life today. And Manjari Kajju is a professor of political science at University of Hyderabad, and she has written on Indian democracy and particularly the rise of Vishwa Hindu Parishad and their role in Indian politics. And so this evening, Professor Pradeep Chhibber and Professor Manjari Kajju will be discussing the book India Tomorrow, which was released recently. This is a book for those of you who haven't had the occasion to look up the information about the book. There was a brief write-up in our email invite, but if you have missed that very quickly, this is I was reading the parts of the book, and it's a wonderful collection of interviews with the next generation Indian political leaders. Altogether, there are 20 of them, and all of them have very prominent public roles. And this is a collection that has come out of the conversations that both Pradeep as well as Harsh had with the young leaders, political leaders of India. And this is a compilation which really gives us some insight into what our tomorrow is going to be like. And let's hear from both Pradeep Chhibber and Manjari Kajju what the future holds for us and for India. Thank you once again, Pradeep Chhibber and Manjari Kajju. And on my own behalf and on behalf of my fellow directors, Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinnara Murthy, I welcome you once again to this evening's session and hand it over to you. Manjari, over to you.
Yes, yes. Thanks, Professor Vijay. Vijay, if I might. I want to join you in welcoming Pradeep to the Hyderabad Literary Festival platform. Nice meeting you again, Pradeep, after our meeting earlier this year for our department's seminar.
Yes.
You were there, and I may remind you, it was in January, and
yes.
Money, Power, and Politics. So
yes.
I welcome you. And I mean, it's sad that the other author, Harsh Shah, couldn't be with us, couldn't join us this evening. And before I start the question answer session, I just wanted to take 1 minute on the book. And I won't take long because, once I start the questions, the book will open up on its own. And the audience would be able to see the analysis, the insights, the elaborations which are there in the book. So India Tomorrow, as Vijay said, is a book, a book about conversations, about interviews with 20 young leaders. And these leaders belong to different states. They belong to both the national and regional parties. And interestingly, the cutoff age is 50 years. And when the interviews were done, the authors saw that the age cutoff is 50 years, not more. But we also know that India is forever young. So even the leaders, 70 years, it's considered young in the Indian political parlance. But yes, 50 years is a cutoff age, and there are 15 men leaders, 5 women leaders. Just to give you a bit of statistics, 7 BJP leaders, 7 regional leaders, 5 belong to the Congress, and 1 independent. Um, what I want to say here is that the conversations in the book not only reflect the nature of the young leaders, how they are committed to their work, how do they work, how do they sort of move in the political arena, but also, and this is something which is important for me, and it would be for the readers as well, the audience today, that the book reflects what India is today, and how Indian politics has evolved over the years, what our Indian political culture is, and how, in fact, this is also something very important which I felt, which I should bring in front of the audience, that how do these political leaders uh, view each other, view the rivals, view, what is the view about political leaders in other political parties, how do they work, how do they go about working within, the political process, the administrative system, and the legal processes. So, with that background, and something else which I should bring out, that what is important here, that how the book has been put together, about the contents of the book, the people in the book, and the politics of India. So with that, I want to start this session. Start the question answer session. First of all, I would like to know from Pradeep, why this theme? What drew you to it? You have looked earlier in your books. You have looked at political parties, the party system. Your latest book also was, ideology and identity, was looking at party systems. But now, why on leadership? Why young leaders?
Okay, first, thank you, Manjari, if I may, and Professor Vijay Manjari for taking time out to speak to us, and Professor Vijay for organizing this event. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the Hyderabad Literary Festival and whoever is listening for taking time out of your day to listen to us, to listen to this conversation. So thank you so much. There are a couple of reasons for writing this book. One is the purely intellectual reason is that we rarely get the opportunity to have long form conversations with our political leaders, with India's political leaders. I still have an Indian passport, so I will say our political leaders. And because we don't have these long form interviews in which we try and speak not about the day-to-day politics. So when most of these politicians are in the news all the time. They've been interviewed multiples of times, but often those interviews are focused on the day-to-day politics. And what we wanted to do was step back and actually get a sense of how do these people think? And so the purpose of the book really was to get, in some ways, figure out the things that make these politicians click, and B, more importantly, and I cannot express this as well as I should be able to, which is how they connect the dots. Because each of them has a slightly different interpretation of Indian politics, of their own political party, of their own situation. And our interest merely is to present how they connect the dots. And what we've done intentionally is, in some senses, let the reader draw their own conclusions. So if you read the book, and I hope you do, our introductions are very light. We don't give deep analytic insights or dwell much into how people draw these connections, because we felt it is important that the reader reach their own conclusions. And so in some senses, it is trying to bring a particular voice to the public space. The other reason, of course, is academic. I've written a book on ideology and identity. I'm mostly a number cruncher. And so, people said, listen, you've written all this stuff, but does ideology even matter? Do Indian politicians even think differently? And so the purpose was, are there differences in how they think about India and how they think the politics of India is structured? And I think my view is that those differences do emerge, but we don't mention it. But those differences can be seen across parties and across individuals.
This book has conversations with I would just name a few leaders, young leaders like Varun Gandhi, Priyanka Gandhi Vadra, Supriya Sule, Smriti Irani, Rahul Gandhi, Asaduddin Owaisi, Jignesh Mewani, Jyotiraditya Scindia, Omar Abdullah, to name some. Why, as you said that, if we adopt this, take this approach of conversations, it is something which whether a reader can draw his or her own conclusions. But why this format? Why format of interviews? Why not a commentary? And when you're explaining politics or explaining evolution of politics, why not adopt a commentary approach? Why interviews?
Okay, now there are a number of, pragmatically, there were books out with commentaries on young politicians. Other people have written some books on them, though nobody's had 20 interviews. Quite frankly, and I think the reason for not writing is, so the question you're asking is, why did we just have a very light introduction and just reproduce the interview? And most of these interviews have just been mildly edited for language. Otherwise, we've let everybody, as we say in the introduction, speak in their own language. So you'll see they all express themselves slightly differently as well. Now, the reason for not giving a commentary was that if we had given a commentary as it is, and to be, for those who are here listening, and you know this very well, that even the process of asking questions is in some sense structuring what we want to hear. In other words, we are leading the conversation. The person responds, we ask a question. So in other words, there is already some intent there. There is some leading of the conversation through our questions. So it's not that there is no, in some senses, commentary, if you will, purely from a lit crit perspective. But if we had put them together in a narrative form, then that would have been our view of the politicians rather than their view of themselves.
Yes.
And I think we were more focused on getting their view of themselves. Because if you think about it, and the other way to ask yourself this question, readers will read the book as they will, is that when we ask politicians these questions, they answer them. And when they're answering them, in some senses, that is how they would like to present themselves. That is, and to be even more direct, that is how they would like to present themselves to a bunch of academics. Right? It is their presentation, as Irving Kaufman said, the presentation of the self in everyday life.
Yeah. My next question is that, did you face any difficulty in contacting these people or while conducting the interviews? Can you tell our viewers that what were the difficulties you came across while putting together this book?
The difficulties are threefold. First is, it is not easy to reach these politicians. So one of the reasons we have these 20 and not others is because these are the 20 we could reach. And once we reached 20, we thought we had done enough. So one is, it's not difficult to get access to them. Second is, even if you get access to them, it is not easy to see them. So in other words, for instance, if I make an appointment, if I can get through to somebody who can get us to KT Ramarao, which is a real life example from Hyderabad, but then the question is, will KT Ramarao agree for an interview, and how long do we have to wait? And I remember waiting in Hyderabad in his office for a couple of hours and nothing happened. Then we went to interview Mr. Owaisi, and the next day somehow Mr. K.T. Ramarao says, I'll give you half an hour. We said, that's fine. The conversation ended up being an hour and a half. So it is not easy to get access to people. And there are some people we would have liked to interview, we could not get access to. So for example, Yogi Adityanath, we could not get access to Mr. Adityanath. We didn't have, to be honest, the connections. And a lot of this depends on, can you actually find a connection with the politician this politician then has to take, and they're very busy people. They will take an hour and a half out of their day to actually have a free form conversation about an academic book, right? This is their lowest priority in most days. So I think, that is the other major difficulty we faced. And you had other question after that was about?
It's about contacting them and the difficulties going about the interviews. In terms of canceling of appointments and all you have stated.
All that was routine. So it took you're going to Delhi, Harsh was coming to Delhi for the interview gets cancelled. Mr. Akhilesh Yadav, I suddenly get a call saying, hey, come.
Yeah.
Come within the next, be in Safai at 5 o'clock. It's 12. And, okay, now I have to go to Safai and be there at 5 because that's how it works. So in other words, there's a lot of this last minute cancellation, not being able to get to them, waiting around for long stretches of time. And the interviews, that's why the interviews took over almost a year to complete. So, and two people doing this all the time, trying to get these things done. So it was not, so that was a bit of a challenge. But the one thing I will say, and perhaps we can talk about this as well, is the fun thing about doing the interviews were all the politicians, not one of them said, give me the questions in advance. They all said, you can ask me anything you want. They have not asked for the transcripts. We interviewed them. They said, you can ask me anything you want. And we were free to ask whatever we wanted to ask. There was one person who said, send me the questions in advance, and we did not interview that person.
My next question is that, we talk so much about dynasty in Indian politics. And when I saw the list of the interviewees, I saw that there are 17 dynasts and 3 non-dynasts, if I may say so. So I just want to pose this question. Is this something structural about Indian politics that, political lineage and established political families are the ones who are giving these leaders? Or is it a bias amongst us political scientists that we go to them or we see that these are the representatives of politics today? What would you say to that?
I think that's a great question, and both things are true. So the way the list was, if you will, curated, if you can call this a curation, but the way the list was curated was by asking journalists in Delhi and asking other politicians who are the important politicians in India. And most of them pointed to these people. So in other words, this was a kind of a selection process. We didn't come up with the name in some random order. There was no statistical algorithm lying behind this. There are some names that are obvious, Mr. Asaduddin Owaisi, Priyanka, Rahul, Akhilesh Yadav, there are some names that are obvious, but to get to the other names, we actually had to we did as if you want statistical parlance, did snowball sampling, ask people, who do we talk to next? Who do you think that's missing from the list? So when we would interview somebody, we would show them the list and say, who else do you think we should interview? So we started with the names, we started with 12 names and ended up with 20. And there were actually 24 or 25 on the list. So that's the first thing. So in other words, there is a bias. So your point is absolutely right. There's a bias among people that there is dynasty. These dynasts get to be political leaders. So I think that's correct. I think the other question you're asking about dynasty is much more complex. And the reason is that Indian politics is dynastic for sure. We all know that, but it's dynastic in a unique way. That I think, if I recall right, politics in Japan and the Philippines and Indonesia is much, much more dynastic than India. So if you think of who gets to be a member of the Diet in Japan, it's mostly, pardon the gendered language, it's mostly the son of the legislator, right, who retires. So Japan has very, very high dynasty rates compared to India, at least within the legislature, within the diet. But what makes Indian parties unique is that India is perhaps the only country in the world where parties are run by dynasts. So we have, other than a couple of parties, and we all know the names, all other parties are run by dynasts, which means the central leader in the party is a dynast. So that is why you end up with the situation that if you're going to interview somebody from a regional party, you will end up interviewing a dynast.
One more question about Indian politics, the way it has evolved, before I go to the leaders themselves. Um, do you think India has moved from a quiet, a quiet politics, a politics of consensus, to a more demand-driven, to a more fragmented politics, and that's reflected in these political leaders? I mean, in fact, the way they approach work, the way they carry about, going about their tasks. So this was my question, from consensus to, as you say, unanimity, to more fragmented and more contested politics.
It's a glass half full, glass half empty perspective. And this is, this is not what the book is about. But my view is that I think the real question is that when there was it consensus or was it containment?
Right.
So think, for example, of the Congress parties of the 1950s and 60s. Indeed, there was some consensus. But if you were to look at who was running Indian politics then, it was mostly the elite. It was mostly landlords. It was mostly upper caste people. It was the personalities of these very, very strong leaders. So other people didn't really have the chance to have their voices heard. So I think on the one hand, there was consensus, but I think in the consensus, there was a sense of containment as well. And I think what's happened now is that that sense of containment, if you will, is gone. And politics is what it is like many other parts of the world, which is it is brutal and contested and loud, especially democratic politics. And of course, you know this better than most people, that has been amplified substantially by media and by the presence of, more extreme political forces, which are actually agitating, which have, by the very nature of being extreme, have to agitate the loudest.
Going to the personalities in the book, what comes out in the conversations is that Varun Gandhi, Rahul Gandhi, and even Aditya Thakeray are more ideologically similar than one would imagine. Can you explain that to our audience a bit more?
So what we find in this book is that all in, so Aditya Thakeray is, now a minister in the Maharashtra government. He's Shiv Sena. Rahul Gandhi is, leader of the Congress party. Varun Gandhi, who, likes to think of the socialist leaders of Britain as his heroes, is, with the BJP. But they're all in favor of state-led intervention for looking after the interests of the poor. So that's one thing. At least Rahul Gandhi and Varun Gandhi clearly are. Aditya Thakeray, we'll just bracket for a moment. But I think the need to provide social services is true across all political parties. And the reason I think is pretty simple, that if you're in a country which is as, where so many people are deprived of basic economic livelihood, and so many people need social services, I don't think you can be an Indian politician and be of the right in the conventional sense, that you cannot, so we like to, many people say Indian politics is not ideological. Well, it is not ideological if you just think of ideology in terms of should the state be actually intervening and providing welfare to the people. No political party can actually afford not to do that, because that is the ground reality. You cannot be a politician for the rich for purely pragmatic reasons. One is you will get no votes. And the other is for purely, if you care about the country, you cannot walk away from doing something for the poor. And we don't have a solution outside of the state to actually deliver services to the poor. There is no market-based solution that is going to deliver social services to the poor yet. So if the state is going to do it, that's something most Indian politicians will not disagree on. So even the current BJP government or the Congress government, as far as the welfare policy is concerned, the differences are on the margin, but they're all engaged in welfare schemes. And I think that's the reason so I think one of the reasons we think they're ideologically similar is because we have a very particular notion of ideology. And the ideology is there should be this left-right spectrum where you should have an economic right and an economic left. And I think that doesn't work so well in the Indian context for the reasons I just stated.
What about Jignesh Mevani? You state in the book that the conversation with him was unlike any other you had, and he has had no grooming like the others. And there's this activist in him, which he himself says is always trying to take over the electoral persona. That he's always on the move. He wants things to change. He's an activist. He's speaking out on the move. So tell our audience a little more about that interview, if you can.
So first, Jignesh Mevani was the most unusual politician we interviewed for one reason. Most of the other politicians, and I'll say this to the readers, seem to live pretty comfortable lives. In other words, they have large offices, they have large staff, they're all reasonably well-to-do people by Indian standards or by standards, I think, anywhere in the world. So that's the first thing. Jignesh Mevani was unusual. He lives in a small flat. There are lots of people around. You sit on his bed. As we say in the main book, you sit on his bed and you have this conversation. And he's remarkably forthright about his own weaknesses, which is unusual. In other words, he still hasn't learned the tropes, if you will, of ideological of being an Indian politician, where you rarely reflect on your own weaknesses. And in one of the most touching moments, I think he's quite clear. He says, I'm an activist and I wish I was an activist. But the problem with being an activist is you can't get anything done in India. By just being an activist, you need to be part of the political process. And I think this is something we should all acknowledge, that being a social activist in India is not easy unless you can actually take part in politics. And that's something we need to, if you're thinking about Indian society and Indian politics, that's a really deep observation. And if you need to join electoral politics, the question is, do I join a political party or do I remain independent? He thinks all political parties are corrupt. And therefore, he chooses to remain an independent, fully well understanding that his reach is going to be limited. But then he's also aware of his own shortcomings, and he's quite clear. In fact, he says in the interview that, maybe for instance, I've not treated the women in my life particularly well. Sometimes when I reflect upon myself, I think my behavior should have been better. And that's an unusual confession for a politician to make. And that's an unusual statement for a politician to make. It's somebody who's fully self-aware of what his weaknesses are. He's also extremely sure of what his worldview is. And his worldview is the intersection of capital and class, which means in Indian society, capital and caste. Capital and class are intertwined, which means people representing the interests of capital are also representing the interests of the upper castes. And those two things cannot really be separated that easily.
What about the differences between the men young leaders and the women young leaders? I mean, you have had conversations with Smriti Irani, Poonam Mahajan, Supriya Sule, and a few others. What is the view of politics? Is it very tough for them as compared to the men leaders to to go about their careers as political leaders, or they feel that it's just the same? I mean, what is their
If I may indulge you, and I will read this brief excerpt from Poonam Mahajan's interview. We asked Poonam Mahajan this question, which is it difficult to be a female politician? And I'll talk about this in a moment. She said, she talked about, being a woman, and she said, it is quite a challenge as a mother. I'll tell you about one incident, and I'll quote the person. Kiran Kher and I were chatting. One male MP came to us and said, हम लोगों ने एक discussion किया था, तुम लोग नहीं आए नहीं? She answered him, क्या करना भाई साहब, हमारी बीवियां तो नहीं हैं, right? But I think more than, to me, the most powerful statement made in this entire book as far as the relationship of women in politics was the one made by Smriti Irani. She said it is not difficult being a woman in politics, but it is difficult being a woman in power. That men will not listen to you. And she gives lots of examples of how men, bureaucrats, scientists will try and put her down just because she is a female politician. So entering female, and the other thing we realize, if we think of the women we've interviewed, they all needed family support, which means their families were supportive of them entering politics. You know, Poonam Mahajan, who is the youngest of the lot in some senses in her career, was quite explicit that, you know, her family is quite chill about her being in politics, right? And so you need the family support. Not only do you need the family support, but then once you have the family support, exercising power is a completely different beast, if you will. And I think that's where I think what Smriti Irani said was something that actually stopped me in my tracks. I think it was a really, really powerful statement.
Since we are talking about the young women leaders, I want to bring in Priyanka Gandhi Vadra here. And again, we see there's a transition from a relatively sheltered family life, though, it's, as you said very powerfully in the book, that for her, the personal is political. That dictum fits very well there, that even in her personal life, it's all been, political. I mean, it's been just politics all around, and very traumatic in a way, a traumatic childhood of the assassination of the grandmother, and and then she says that as children we used to be really scared when our father used to go out as a political leader, that when is he going to come back, and whether he's going to come back or not, scared. And then the father's assassination, uh, and now we see a transition from that family life to a more the outward politics. General secretary of the one of the general secretaries of the Congress party, and also of a very important state of Uttar Pradesh. So can you give us a bit more insight into that conversation which you had with her, bringing out these aspects of family and politics?
I think it was a remarkably forthright conversation from my perspective. And it was remarkably forthright in the sense that she was quite clear that she was going to enter politics earlier, but she didn't know if it was the right thing to do. And she did Vipassana, she tried to figure out what is it that she really wanted to do. And she, for her own self-discovery reasons, felt it was not be appropriate for her to have entered politics 10 years ago or 15 years ago. She actually has waited because she thinks this is the right time for her to enter politics. In other words, this is a conscious personal decision, because she felt that she was entering politics perhaps maybe if she entered politics right when she was expected to, she may not have been entering it for the right reasons, which is the reasons for pursuing a particular ideological agenda and for pursuing, in her views, working for the betterment of people and being a more successful politician. In other words, she may have been entering politics just for the reasons of this is what I'm expected to do, and therefore, because I'm Priyanka Gandhi, I should be in politics, right? And so I think her view, that's my perception. This is not, she doesn't say this, but I think she's given this some thought. And she's decided that, listen, there is a time for doing things, and maybe now is the time for me to enter politics.
Coming to Rahul Gandhi, and you state in the book, and we all saw in 2017, his visit to Berkeley. You had organized that event, that interview, and then again you meet him, and he's again fairly open, about questions that you ask me any question, and I'm willing to answer. And he brings this out quite clearly that in his rival, the BJP, he's not seeing just a political party, but an entire machinery, which is the institutional machinery, which he has to fight against,
Yeah.
in the political terrain. Tell us a little more about this conversation. Was it a change? Did you see a change from 2017 to 2019, or you felt that it's more or less the same, or the issues he's thinking about, the issues he's bringing in, articulating in politics, and in the conversation are different?
So I think his personality is pretty much the same. He's quite warm and effusive. And so I think his personality has not changed. I think he reads quite a bit, at least that's what he told us. And I think, as I said, as we say in the book, he cited Darwish, this Palestinian poet, about, who he is, right? And about learning things from even within a jail cell. So I think it was all pretty. So I think as far as his personality goes, it didn't change very much. Now, it's the question you're asking is a little bit difficult for me to answer, because the questions we asked in Berkeley and the questions we asked in Delhi were different. And the question, so we can't say exactly say if it's changed, things have changed, but I think what's happened is, my sense is, and this is just my view, and so, he may not agree with this, but my view is that I think there was a little bit more optimism in 2017 than in this interview, in the sense that in 2017, I think there was an idea, especially since this was the first interview, that there was a hope that the Congress would do well. And, unfortunately, the Congress didn't do. In fact, its performance didn't change from 2014. So I think if you're the leader of a party and some event like that happens, you're obviously going to be taken aback, because you have an expectation, and everybody expected the Congress to do better. And then all of a sudden they don't do well. So I think there is a sense that maybe the fight you're fighting is actually a lot more difficult than one thought it was initially, because this is no longer a fight between two political parties, but it's a fight between an entrenched a party that is entrenching itself in Indian institutions versus an outsider political party. Now, for though you know this better than most people, and that if you study Indian history, and especially post-independence Indian history, this is what many opposition parties used to say about the Congress. That is extremely difficult to contest, not only a party, but a party that controls all the institutions of the state. Right? So I think what's happening in India is that once a party comes to power, it actually uses the institutions of the state and the media. They all work together in some sense to ensure, right? And this has changed dramatically since the last 5 years, the media landscape especially, but you use these institutions to buttress and support the political party. And so I think he's finding, and that I think, to my view, that was a little bit more surprising this time around, but that's my guess, because we didn't ask him the same question, so I can't say, but I think he was surprised by how deep the opposition, it's not only opposition in the terms of ideas, but the institutions of the Indian institutions are supporting the BJP.
Now I want to come back to Hyderabad. This is the Hyderabad Literary Festival. Coming back to Hyderabad, the two young leaders interviewed in the book from the South are both from Telangana, K.T. Ramarao and Asaduddin Owaisi. And I want to bring them both in the conversation, in this question, that both of them are modernizers. I mean, both of them are, in their own constituencies, in their own political terrain, I must say,
Yeah.
are, working to modernize things, to change things, to bring in technical know-how, to bring in education. And and also this sort of, they are sort of always on the move. I mean, it was very interesting when I read that you were waiting for Asaduddin Owaisi, that, there'll be a convoy of cars which is going to come, but he comes on a motorbike and very coolly, and he says that, this is an easier way of meeting people and keeping in touch with my constituency. So, for our audience here, I want you to relate, this sort of booming of Hyderabad, the Hyderabad economy. These dynamic leaders there. Uh, uh, Uwaisi, who's representing Hyderabad, I think is in the fourth term, and K.T. Rama Rao, along with his father, the chief minister, Mr. Chandrasekhar Rao, doing things for Hyderabad. So, what links them, and what is it about Hyderabad that is going to sort of change, or it's something which, is it positively linked, the two leaders in Hyderabad? What did you see in your conversations with them, about politics? Are they,
Great
are they,
question.
are they, are they
Are they?
here to stay?
Oh, yes, they're both here to stay. And I think what's interesting too is how they're both wrestling, at least, and K.T. Rama is very explicit about this, how they're both wrestling with, trying to modernize, to use a real cliche, a society, to introduce economic development and economic modernization. Modernization is a strong word to use, and, economic growth, if you will, industrial development, either through software or more conventional industries, bring economic growth and economic change to a society that in which the politics is still structured by caste and community. So, and I think that is the real tension you see with Akhilesh Yadav, who mentions this quite clearly in his interview, and that's something you see also with K.T. Ramarao. And Asaduddin Owaisi doesn't say this, but is quite explicit as well in his interview, if you think about it, the way you pose the question. So K.T. Ramarao says, I grew up, in this relatively, if you will, urban environment. And, at heart, if you will, a believer in, bringing, if you pardon the use word of the language, I'm a modernizer and I'm going to modernize Indian society, modernize Telangana. But once I'm entering politics, I hate community and caste explicitly. And I think Akhilesh Yadav says exactly the same thing, which is that in UP, that's the challenge I face. I did development, but instead, unfortunately, politics of caste and religion came into the forefront. And I think Asaduddin Owaisi doesn't say this. He cares about secular education for Muslims. He cares deeply about the Muslim community. He cares about education in the Muslim community, the economic well-being of the Muslim community. That is what drives him. And I can see why that's a good thing to do, but he's also, in some senses, running into the same hurdle, which is the moment you start seeing the Muslims as a religious community rather than a community that has the same needs as everybody else, education, jobs, etc., you enter into this contested terrain of, politics, of economic growth, economic change versus the politics of caste and community. And I think that's an underlying tension that shows up in these three regional leaders very, very explicitly, and especially not explicitly with Asaduddin Owaisi, but explicitly with K.T. Ramarao and Akhilesh Yadav, and implicitly with Asaduddin Owaisi as well. Right? Because he's always portrayed as a Muslim, as a religious person with certain stereotypes associated with it, whereas his concern is not about stereotypes. His concern is about, listen, can I get education for girls? Can I get, the Muslim youth in Telangana out and get them jobs all over the world, right? That's what he cares about. But instead of focusing on what he's doing good for the community, people are more interested in, as he himself says, a politician with a cap is an extremely popular person on the Indian media these days.
Yes.
Yeah.
Coming to Devendra Fadnavis, and he's a person who's completed his 5-year term, which is, very difficult in a state like Maharashtra, and you say that, and you state that in the book. And fairly young person. And what comes out in the book is that he has a very friendly personality, very accommodating approach, and he says that people should remember me by the positive difference I have been able to make. Tell us more about that conversation. How did he come across as a person when you were interviewing him?
I see. Okay, I will say this to your viewers, and I said to you as well, and more to your viewers as well. These are extremely smart people, all of them. They're very clever, and because they deal with people all day long. I'm just another person who shows up. They are very good at reading people and saying what they think needs to be said on particular occasions. So, often we try to say, listen, by this, I figured the truth out. I don't think we figured out the truth. We figured out how they like to say and present themselves in particular occasions. So I think let's keep that in mind. So I think he comes across as extremely positive, but he's also, and I think this is one thing we've noticed in actually I think almost every politician, they're also very playful with their language. So I remember we did this talk at CPR, and I asked one question. There was Milind Deora and Devendra Patel were on the call, and I asked the question you asked. I asked Devendra Patel, how do you remain positive? How do you remain so smiling, and especially when politics is so cutthroat, because everybody wants your seat, right? So how can you be positive and paranoid at the same time? And he laughed because he understands where it's coming from, right? So in other words, what's interesting if you think about it from the other perspective is if you don't get into the presentation of self, these are relatively, if you will, thick-skinned people. They know that politics is a game that will come with wins and losses. And that if you hunker yourself down without the smile on your face and your ability to actually continue through those difficulties, you will not be successful as a politician. So by nature, they have to have a friendly personality. They have to be friendly and angry at the same time. They have to be friendly and sad at the same time. But you have to be that, because otherwise you cannot succeed in politics. Politics is a people business. It's a business in which you're constantly dealing with people in your party, other people who want your position. You're trying to maneuver your way around them. But to do that successfully, you have to be able to retain your sense of being able to deal with people at a friendly level. Because if I was to get angry with you and you were to get angry with me at all times, we would not have a relationship. So if politics, especially intra-party politics, internecine politics, is about this relationship building. And because it's about relationship building, you have by definition to be friendly and open. And most of them are, because that's their job. That's who they're, that's what they've become. So, that's why I think that was, and they're extremely, I'll say this to the people who are listening as well, and to you, they're also very thoughtful people. They're not, just fly by night. We have this weird impression of them that, they don't know what they're doing. They know pretty well what they're doing. They're pretty clever. And just because of the people skills, constant people interaction, they have to be friendly. Because if they weren't, they would not be in politics. Sorry for that long rant.
No, it was good. In fact, it was quite good. I mean, the way you explained the way things work with these leaders. My next question is that you say at one place that the politicians, the young leaders you interviewed were far wealthier than the average Indian. So I just
far wealthier.
Wealthier.
Yes.
Yeah, wealthy. Yes. But I was just thinking about this. If you had interviewed more people like Jignesh Mevani, I mean, the situation would have been different. I mean, it would, leaders like Atishi Marlena or MP Rajesh or even Kavita Krishnan.
Yes.
Maybe this question or this issue would have led in the other direction. Yes. What would you say to that? Again, I'll say, is it bias of the political scientists? It's our bias that we go towards these established families.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you're right, and your criticism is on the spot, which is, I think that is correct. If we had gone to a different class of leaders, Jignesh Mevani is not well to do. But these are the leaders of political parties, and for reasons you as a political scientist know really well, there's a reason they're wealthier than the average person, right? Because you need to run, you're running a political party, there's all kinds of reasons for that. But I think the really interesting project to do, and I will just say this given our conversation, is perhaps it is time to do a book with 20 not so well-known leaders. And then compare the demeanor, if you will, the way they interact with people in contrast to these more well-established political leaders. Because it is not only about power and resources, it is about how you deal with people. And the thing is that are the party leaders actually deal with people in a very, very different way than these younger leaders? And I do not know the answer to that. I don't know. Right. So I think maybe that should be a next project. I think you have some time on your hands, right? Just joking.
Professor Vijay has come, so I'm sure he's come with the audience questions. But before I leave, before I keep my mouth shut, one last question. Something I found very interesting in the book was this question which you posed: what would you like to be remembered by? Yes. And, various political leaders had various answers. I mean, somebody wants to be remembered as a humanist, somebody as audacious, innovative, and somebody as, standing by rights. And then, of course, Asaduddin Owaisi, that I want to be remembered as a person who strongly believed in the Indian Constitution. But I found Priyanka Gandhi Vadra's and Rahul Gandhi's responses very different. They said that, I mean, we don't believe in a legacy. We don't want, once we are gone, we don't want to be remembered. So I found that, why should we be remembered? Why should I be remembered? And I don't bother. Rahul Gandhi says, I am not bothered about what people think after I'm gone. So can you just, throw a little more light on this about your experiences and these responses?
No, I thought we just thought there should be a fun question in the end about, just if there's one word to describe you. And the reason for asking that question was pretty simple, which is that, it's easy because we wanted to get a sense of who they think of them, what do they think of themselves? What is the thing that they think they would like people to know? Because the book will be published, right? And so by this point, we've been talking to them for an hour and a half, their guard's a little bit down. So, what is it that comes to your mind? And if you think of Asaduddin Owaisi, the fact that he says, I'm a believer in the Indian Constitution is completely in line with his political views. Right? But he has to believe in the Indian Constitution, because if you believe in the Indian Constitution, within the framework of the Indian Constitution, you can do very well for his constituents. But if you don't believe in the Indian Constitution, it is extremely difficult. Smriti Irani, who says, I would like to be remembered as audacious, or thank God she's somebody else's problem now, right? Is because I think she actually believes that, she is a strong personality, and you have to be a strong personality to succeed as a woman in Indian politics. You cannot be, quiet and, shy. Nobody can, no Indian politician can. And as far as Rahul and Priyanka Gandhi goes, that's a tougher one, because I think if you think of Priyanka's life, I think she's writing a book, and once the book comes out, you'll find out more about this. But I think there is, I think, a religious philosophical angle to not being remembered. For both of them, I think there's an underlying sense of that. But it could also be, and I do not know this, and I think that could be a genuinely felt belief. And if you take the interviews at face value, that's what they're really saying. Now, you could also give it a cynical interpretation, and the cynical interpretation is no politician would like to say, I would like to be remembered for the rest of my life, because that's a little bit of an, ego trip, if you will. And none of them they're clever enough not to make sure that is not how they present themselves.
So with that, I don't know, I'm sure there are audience questions there, and Professor Vijay would tell us and I think pose those questions. So I'll hand over to Professor Vijay.
Yeah, hang in there, Manjari. It's not that you sign off. So if you want to intervene, you can always intervene.
No, I'm there.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
there.
So it's not going to be, just me and Pradeep now, but be there. It's a fascinating conversation, and particularly, I think anything to do with politics is very interesting. But before I, ask the questions on behalf of the audience, I had a couple of curiosities, if you wish. One is that when you said, quoting Jignesh Mevani, that there is very little scope for activism in India. I was also wondering whether the Indian political scene is so divided among political parties. Is there any space for civil society movements in India? I mean, did you feel that that there is a space that is still open for, say, the kind of Anna Hazare kind of movements? Or do you think that everybody, like, for example, Kejriwal, have to start a political party and then, jump on the bandwagon?
So this is my view, and I'm going to say something that is not very comfortable. So my apologies in advance. And let me say it in the most provocative way, just for the sake of debate. I hope you don't mind. I think Indians have a very strong sense of associational life, but that associational life normally doesn't extend beyond family. It's by and large family and friends, but family is number one. Number two, this is something we don't want to admit, but whatever associational life there is, civic association, as people associating, it happens through religious participation in religious activities. So those are two spaces where we Indians are taking part in associational life. Now the question you're asking is, what about civil society organizations? And I think those civil society organizations exist, but the landscape is very fragmented. And even the Anna Hazare movement came and went. I mean, the movement just died pretty quickly. The movement doesn't exist anymore in some senses, because there is no one person who can actually organize a movement that can actually even be powerful across an entire state. Take, for example, the current farmers movement. Even now, despite what's happening with agriculture in India, despite the fact the government has introduced a bill which may be popular or unpopular depending on your perspective, but the ability of farmers to launch a massive movement is limited. And the reason it's limited is, I think that given the strong presence of family and religion, and if you will caste, even if you would care about that, and politics, the space for civil society is much more limited. I know for urban Indians, that's not easy words to say, given that so many of my friends are in that space. But I think that space is also extremely fragmented.
Yeah, that's the kind of feeling that I always got, that since you mentioned the urban spaces where we live, there's a lot of activity but very little activism.
Yes.
The kind of sustained belief in something, I think that's something that has disappeared.
Yes.
And one other question that I had while I was going through the interviews in your book was that if you see them as a collective, the 20 leaders that you interviewed, if you see them as a collective, do you get a sense that they have a clear vision of future, of India's future? Or do they see themselves merely as fighting the next election? Do they have a long-term vision for India?
That's a difficult question. I think both those things are to some extent true, but that's a bad answer. Okay, so let me give a provocative answer, and I don't know if it's exactly right, but I think what you could see is that they have different visions of India in the long run, which means they all think about India step back, sorry. Let me answer the question in a different way. They think about India in different ways. So, now whether that's long term or short term, I don't know, but their understanding of India differs. So if you look at Priyanka Gandhi versus Poonam Mahajan versus Rahul Gandhi versus Jagdish Mevani or Akhilesh Yadav, they all have their own very particular understandings of India. There is some overlap within the BJP types, but mostly around the issues of nationalism. They don't want to talk about religion, which is at the heart of what the BJP is, and Manjari knows this better than anybody else. But the idea is that they all think about India in different ways. Not in economics, as I said before, but their perception of India. Is India a community of castes? Is India religiously divided? Is India under the throes of a particular religious ideology or a religious identity? Right? So they have very particular understandings of India. So I think to answer your question, I'm not so sure I can answer whether they're thinking of the next election or they're thinking in the long run. I think the book, and I didn't think of it in these terms, but their current understandings of India are different. And I think therefore that informs their politics and their long-term view for India as well. I would guess that's what would follow.
Yeah, naturally, once if their diagnosis differs from each other, obviously the solution to
will differ.
Will differ.
Nicely put.
Yeah. So I also wanted to know who are the leaders that you wanted to include but could not, because I could think of a couple of them very easily,
Yes.
but I would like to hear from you.
So I think we would have liked to interview, we could have liked to interview, I'll remember, Yogi Adityanath. We would have liked to interview Mr. Reddy in Andhra,
okay,
right? Shaw, right?
Yeah.
We would have liked to interview, I think we had a couple of names in the Northeast we missed. And I think we missed, unfortunately in Tamil Nadu, we couldn't find a younger leader right now who would come off the bat, who's having a large national impact or even a very large impact in Tamil Nadu off the bat. So those I think are the 3 or 4 people I think we really, really missed. And then there are some others, as Manjari pointed out, there are lots of, if you will, not national, not people who are running parties, but people who are active in politics and are important players in their own right, which is, it's not the right word to use, but people at if you will, at a second tier, who I think there are many of them. And I think we should have interviewed some of them as well. But then that's, at that point, it's already 300 pages.
Yeah.
So I think that's and I really think that's a project worth doing, which is getting the views of these younger leaders and what are the struggles they face. Those people who not made it to the national level, but who are trying to make it to that level, what are the struggles they face? And I think we need to know that, because if we don't understand that, we'll never understand the entire complexity of the Indian political landscape.
Because when I saw Jignesh Mevani, I was thinking, why Jignesh and why not Hardik Patel?
Yeah. It's just on who we could get. Some of it is who you have connections with, right? And we could find Jignesh easily, why not Omar Khaled? There are lots of other people we could have, right?
There's one question from the audience that I would like to ask. This is Amina Kishore, who is asking, I feel dynasty centering is quite out. It is quite the most debunked issue now. The power centers all around, with minor exceptions, are without the dynasty backing. Would you agree with that?
So when I look at political parties in India, and this is only on political parties, and I thank you for the question, and I take your point well, but when you think of political parties, and I'm a political scientist who studies political parties, so that's my weakness. Every regional party in India is run by dynastic politicians. Politics has become a family business. And this is true in the Philippines, it's true in Japan, it's true in Indonesia, and true in many parts of the world. But in India, what's unusual, as I was saying earlier, is that parties are run by dynasts. So think of the NCP, think of, the TRS, right?
Yeah.
Think of the DMKs, the Shiv Sena, Akali Dal, right? Just Biju Dal, all of them, right? So there's a deeper question. I think the reader is asking, or the listener is asking, the deeper question is, why are Indian parties dynastic? Why does electoral politics rotate around dynastic politics, even though power may be existing in lots of other people? And I think nobody has I have an answer, but that will get too much into the weeds of political science.
Yeah. But to argue the other way around is, since you mentioned the centrality of family in India, right? If we call that a dynasty, I think that's there in almost every field, probably except teaching.
Yes.
Every doctor's son, at least aspires to be a doctor. Every lawyer's son. So there is a kind of a family goodwill that remains, and obviously everybody wants. So I don't think it's limited only to politics.
I think you're absolutely right. In fact, sometimes I say that by asking the question, why are there dynastic parties, we're asking the wrong question. The question we should be asking is, why are there parties that are not dynasties? Because most firms in all over the world are dynastic. They're run by, now, of course, if I was a sociologist or an anthropologist, I would give reasons for it. And the reasons could be patriarchy, right? Strong men. You're a doctor, you ensure that your child will be a doctor because that's the way to proceed. That's what you know, that's what your child should do. And if you have these strong family ties, I think that's what you reproduce and generate, right? And that's what I think could be going on, but I'm just speculating.
Yeah, one last question, which since you mentioned a few leaders and their political and economic views, did you get a sense of the leaders' understanding of culture, or is that too vague a term and too conflictual a term to address? Did they have an understanding and a vision about India's culture?
That's my weakness. We did not ask the question, so I cannot answer it. I think you're absolutely right. We did not ask them any questions about what they thought of Indian culture and what aspects of Indian culture they thought were, interesting and that moved them. And we did not ask that question. And I think that's our weakness. And that's all I can say about it, because anything more would be just idle speculation.
The reason why I asked was, there is a feeling that in India today, politics has actually moved into the sphere of culture because there is no contestation as far as economics is concerned, because everybody's economic vision is more or less similar. And the wrestling actually that is going on is in the field of culture rather than either politics or in economic views.
If you define culture in those ways, Professor Vijay, then I think the struggle is about identity politics in some ways. And I think both Manjari and I would agree that that's what's going on. But that's what's been going on for a very, very long time. It was just, as I would say, there was no consensus, but it was contained for a long time. If you think of Ram Manohar Lohia complaining about the fact that the Nehru program just completely dismissed the interests of the backward castes, that's what he was talking about.
But do you think the identity politics still has a future, or do you think it has been subsumed by ideological politics?
What is the difference between ideological and identity politics?
You should tell me that. Because one kind of analysis is that politics based on caste identities, etc., seem to have taken a backseat with the emergence of an all across the board ideology like Hindutva. So do you think the other kind of identity politics, do you think that has lost its steam?
I would actually, I've written this, I will say this, I don't think Hindutva politics has an ideology. I think Hindutva politics is about identity. It is about a Hindu identity versus a Muslim identity or a Christian identity. So I don't think there is any deep cultural undertones to it. So if you ask people who are in the Hindutva world, what is your view of who is a Hindu or what makes a Hindu. I don't think there's any deep thought given to that. And in fact, I've said this in writing, so I can say this again. I'm not so sure that there is a deep moral vision that undergirds the current Hindutva ideology, especially this all-encompassing version. The RSS has a particular vision, the VHP has a particular vision, and Manjari knows this as very, very well and can articulate this better than I can. But I actually think that if you ask people, what is your moral vision? I'm not so sure there is one.
Well,
And I mean this honestly. This is something we need to think about really, really hard. What is it that you're trying to create?
Yeah.
What is that new moral India going to look like? Even let's for a moment assume it's a Hindutva India. What is the moral foundation of that? And one doesn't know. I have not seen any clear articulation of that. And there are reasons for that, because the moment one says that, there are 330 million deities in India, there'll be 338 million moral views, and then the whole thing will collapse.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pradeep,
Thank you so much.
and thank you, Manjari.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to
Thank you so
Pradeep.
Take care. Pleasure.
And in absentia, thanks to Harsh.
Yes.
So wonderful conversation, and thank you very much. Wonderful book. Enjoyed reading it. And one of the best things is that one doesn't have to read it from page 1 to last, and one can just pick up. I think that's something that I always enjoyed. Going back and forth, and then picking up your own favorites, and then dipping into those interviews.
Yes.
And thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. And I just wanted to make a quick announcement before we sign off for this evening, friends. We will be back on 16th October, same time, 7 p.m. And we will have another online session. And we will have a session on 16th October on cricket. And the book that will be discussed would be a very recent book by the cricket correspondent, Vedam Jayashankar. Vedam has just come out with a very interesting book called Courage, Conviction, Controversy, and Cricket. This is the book that will be discussed on 16th October. And in conversation with Vedam would be the cricketer and writer Harimohan Paru. And this will be on 16th October at 7 p.m. So I hope to see all of you back, and many more of you. And once again, I thank on my own behalf and on behalf of my colleagues, Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinnara Murthy. I thank Pradeep, Harsh, and Manjari for this evening's session. And thank you very much. And welcome to all our viewers once again. This is an invitation to log in once again. And please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell icon so that you get notifications every time we go online. Thank you once again, Pradeep and Manjari, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye then.
Bye-bye.